She arrived in Moose Jaw on the coldest Tuesday in April, carrying one suitcase and a letter she'd read so many times the fold lines had gone soft as cloth. The letter was from a man named Douglas Fenn. It said he was 41, that he owned 300 acres outside of town, that he'd been alone since his wife passed 4 winters ago, and that he was looking for a woman with practical expectations and a willingness to work. It was not a romantic letter. Penny Ashcroft had not been looking for romance. She'd been looking for a way out of a situation in Edmonton that had been closing in on her for the better part of 2 years, and Douglas Fenn's practical letter had felt, at the time, like exactly the right answer to exactly the right problem. She stepped off the Via Rail platform into wind that cut through her coat like it had a personal grievance with her, and she stood there, with her suitcase handle in both hands, looking for a man who'd sent her a photograph of himself standing in front of a red barn. There was no man with a red barn in sight. There was, however, a woman behind the ticket counter who looked at Penny with the particular expression of someone who'd seen this kind of situation before and found it neither surprising nor encouraging. "You the woman coming for Douglas Fenn?" she asked. Penny felt something shift in her chest. "I am." "You'd better sit down then." His heart had given out 3 days prior. He'd been moving hay bales alone, which his doctor had told him not to do, and his neighbor had found him the following morning when he didn't come in for the coffee they shared every Tuesday. He was buried in the churchyard on the hill. The woman behind the counter, her name was Shirley, and she was the kind of person who delivered difficult information with the efficiency of someone who understood that softening it didn't help. Told Penny all of this in the time it took the kettle to boil in the back room. Penny sat with the tea and did not cry. She was too far past crying for things that couldn't be fixed. What she felt instead was a cold, clear understanding of her situation. She had $46 in her account, a return ticket she couldn't afford to exchange, a suitcase with 2 pairs of jeans and every piece of winter clothing she owned, and absolutely no plan. "Is there a bus back to Edmonton tonight?" she asked. "Not until Thursday. Is there somewhere I can stay that's less than $30 a night?" Shirley looked at her for a moment. "There's the Fenn property. His nephew's been out there since yesterday sorting the estate. He's using the main house, but the guest cabin's empty. I could call him. I don't want to impose on. You've got nowhere to go and it's -12 tonight." Shirley was already reaching for the phone. "It's not imposing. It's practical." The nephew's name was Sam Fenn. He pulled up to the station in a truck that had seen 15 Saskatchewan winters and survived all of them through sheer stubbornness, and he looked like a man who operated on the same principle. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, tall in the way that comes from years of physical work rather than any particular attention to posture, and he had the kind of face that didn't give much away. He looked at Penny the way you look at a problem you hadn't accounted for in your planning. "You're Penny Ashcroft," he said. I'm sorry about my uncle. I'm sorry too." He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it. Not in the manner of someone performing chivalry, more like someone who'd assessed the situation and determined this was the most efficient allocation of tasks. "The cabin's got heat and running water. It's not fancy. I don't need fancy." He glanced at her then, briefly, like he was recalibrating something. "All right," he said, "let's go." They drove 30 minutes out of town in near silence. The land opened up flat and enormous under a sky the color of old pewter, and Penny watched it through the passenger window and tried very hard not to think about the fact that she had no idea what she was going to do next. The radio played a country station quietly enough that it was more texture than sound. Sam drove with one hand on the wheel and didn't seem to feel any pressure to fill the silence, which Penny found unexpectedly decent of him. "How long were you and my uncle in contact?" he asked at last. 4 months. We wrote letters. You never met in person." "No." A pause. "But you came anyway." He seemed like a good man. The farm seemed stable. She stopped, because explaining what she'd needed felt like too much information for a cold truck with a man she'd known for 20 minutes. It seemed like a reasonable situation. Sam didn't say anything to that. He nodded once, slowly, like he was filing it away. The cabin was small and wood-paneled and smelled of cedar and old fires, and someone had recently left a folded blanket on the end of the bed and turned the baseboard heaters on. Penny stood in the middle of it and felt, for the first time since Shirley had told her to sit down, something loosen in her chest. It was just a room. But it was a warm room, and no one in it wanted anything from her. She slept for 11 hours. In the morning, she woke to the sound of someone moving around in the yard outside, and she looked through the frost-edged window to see Sam splitting wood in the early light. He had a rhythm to it, unhurried, economical, like someone who had been doing this long enough that it no longer required thought. She watched him for a moment before she realized she was watching him, and then she made coffee on the small two-burner stove and stood at the window with her hands wrapped around the mug. She had $37 now. She'd spent $9 at the gas station on the way out of town on a bottle of water and a box of granola bars. She had 2 days until the bus, no job in Edmonton to go back to. She'd left it to come here, and a lease she'd let lapse because she'd been certain she wasn't going to need it. She'd been so certain. She heard boots on the cabin steps, and then a knock, 2 sharp raps. "Coffee's on," she said, because it seemed like the reasonable thing to say. Sam came in and knocked the snow off his boots and poured himself a mug without being asked, which she found she didn't mind. He sat at the small kitchen table and looked at his coffee and then at her, and the morning light was gray and honest and made everything feel very clear. "I've got a question," he said, "and I need you to know I'm asking it practically, not as any kind of offer." "All right. The property's in a complicated state. My uncle had a dispute running with the land developer on the east side, man named Hargrove. He caught himself. A man who's been trying to acquire this land for 3 years. With Douglas gone, that situation gets more urgent. I've got a lawyer in Regina working on it, but I need to be here, physically, for at least the next few weeks, and the cattle don't stop needing feeding just because the estate's a mess." Penny waited. "I could use someone who knows how to work," Sam said. "If you're willing to stay and help, I can pay you for your time, and you can stay in the cabin. It's not permanent. It's just practical." She thought about Edmonton. She thought about the apartment she didn't have anymore, and the job she'd left, and the particular exhaustion of spending 2 years making decisions that were all about what was least bad. She thought about the flat, empty land outside the window and the fact that she'd slept 11 hours and didn't any of her dreams. "What kind of cattle?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "Hereford, about 60 head. I grew up on a grain farm in Ponoka. I don't know cattle specifically, but I know how to work. That's enough." She stayed. The first week was all logistics and physical exhaustion, and figuring out how to be 2 strangers occupying the same small property without getting in each other's way. Sam was methodical and private, and didn't volunteer information about himself unless it was directly relevant to the task at hand. He explained things once, clearly, and didn't repeat himself, and he didn't hover to check if she'd done them right. Penny found she responded well to being trusted with a task and left alone to complete it. She fed the cattle in the mornings. She learned their patterns faster than she expected. There was one young heifer with a notch in her left ear who always hung back from the feed trough until the others had settled, and Penny started bringing a separate portion to the fence line for her, and Sam noticed but didn't comment on it, and somehow that small unremarked kindness felt like something. She cooked in the evenings because the main house kitchen was better equipped, and Sam never seemed to think about eating until he'd been working for 12 hours, and was past the point of being sensible about it. She made the kinds of meals she knew how to make: roast chicken, lentil soup, things that could be ready whenever someone came in from outside. The first night she set a plate for him and left it on the counter without comment and went back to the cabin, and the next morning the plate was washed and sitting in the drying rack. The second night he came in while she was still cooking and sat at the kitchen table, and they ate together without discussing whether they would. It wasn't companionable exactly. They were still too much strangers for that. But it was comfortable in the way that 2 people can sometimes be comfortable when neither of them is pretending to be more than they are. He told her, over soup on the 3rd night, that his uncle had advertised for a wife because the accountant had told him the estate would pass more cleanly through a marriage. That Douglas Fenn had been a practical man who'd made a practical decision, and that he genuinely believed he could offer someone a decent life. He could have, Sam said. He was a decent man, quiet, kept his word. He sounded like that in his letters, Penny said. "I'm sorry you came all this way." "I'm not," she said, and then stopped, surprised to find she meant it. The developer's name was Gareth Plank, and he arrived at the property on the 8th day in a leased SUV with clean tires, which told Penny he'd never intended to actually walk the land. He was the kind of man who wore fleece vests as a gesture toward outdoor life without ever fully committing to it. He stood in the yard and explained to Sam, with the particular confidence of a man who'd mistaken momentum for inevitability, that the estate would be more manageable if Sam simply agreed to sell the East Quarter now, before probate got complicated. Sam listened to this with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was deciding how few words were necessary. "No," he said. Gareth Plank looked at Penny, as if she might be the more persuadable party. "Don't look at me," she said. "I just work here." Plank left. Sam watched the SUV go up the long driveway and disappear onto the gravel road before he turned around, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not anger, but a kind of settled resolve, like a door closing on something that had been left too long open. "He'll be back," Sam said. "I know, and he'll have a lawyer next time. Then you'll need one too." Sam looked at her. "I have one, a better one than his." A pause. "Probably." "Good," she said, and went back to the fence she'd been mending. It was the ice storm that changed things. It came in on the 3rd week, the way prairie ice storms do, arriving as rain, becoming something else before anyone had quite adjusted to the transition, and by the time Penny realized how bad it was getting, the path between the cabin and the main house was a sheet of glass, and she'd made it halfway across the yard before she went down hard on one knee. She wasn't badly hurt. She'd have a bruise the size of a saucer by morning. But she was still sitting there on the ice, taking inventory of her body and deciding nothing was broken, when Sam appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was across the yard and beside her before she'd managed to get a hand under herself, and he crouched down with the matter-of-fact calm of someone who'd handled emergencies on this land his whole life. And he said, "Where does it hurt?" "My knee." "I'm fine." He didn't argue with her. He put one hand under her arm and helped her up, and then he stood there holding her arm in the ice and the wind, and she became aware of how cold it was, and how close they were standing, and how his hand on her arm was steady, in the way everything about him was steady. "You should stay in the main house tonight," he said. "The cabin porch stairs are iced over." "I don't want to." "Penny?" He said her name simply, the first time he'd used it directly, and something about the simplicity of it stopped her argument. "You can have the spare room. There's a lock on the door if you want one." She looked at him. His face was serious and clear and offered nothing she hadn't asked for. "All right," she said. She did not use the lock. Not because she needed to trust him. She already did, she realized, in the way you come to trust someone when you've watched them make the same honest choice in small situations 17 times in a row. She didn't use the lock because it would have been like putting a bolt across a door that wasn't under any threat of opening. She lay in the spare room and listened to the ice hit the windows and thought about the strange geography of how she'd arrived here. She'd come to marry a dead man and stayed to feed cattle and mend fences, and somehow, without any clear moment she could point to, had stopped feeling like someone moving through someone else's story and started feeling like someone living her own. In the morning, Sam made coffee before she was up, which she found out because she came downstairs to the smell of it, and he was sitting at the table with a folder of papers from the lawyer in Regina, and he looked up when she came in and said, "Good morning." In the same tone he said everything, and she sat down across from him, and they drank coffee in the early quiet of a world still coated in ice. "The lawyer thinks we have a strong case," Sam said. "The East Quarter's been in the family since 1952. Plank's claim relies on a disputed survey from 1989 that my uncle challenged and never formally resolved. Can it be resolved now? That's what the lawyer's working on." He paused. "It'll take a few more weeks." He didn't ask her whether she intended to stay. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, as plain fact, setting it in front of her so she could see it clearly and decide what to do with it. She thought about Edmonton. She thought about it less, she'd noticed. It had stopped feeling like a place she was temporarily away from and started feeling like a chapter with a closed cover. "A few more weeks is fine," she said. He nodded. Just once. The way he always did. Like her answer had confirmed something he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to assume. The land survey hearing was in Regina on a Thursday at the end of April. Sam drove them both in the truck, and they listened to the radio, and he bought her coffee from a drive-thru without asking how she took it, because she'd made it in front of him enough times that he already knew. And that small ordinary knowledge felt, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, like something significant. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Gareth Plank's lawyer was polished and expensive and cited precedents that, Sam's lawyer explained to her afterward in the courthouse hallway, were not as applicable as Plank believed them to be. Sam gave his testimony without notes, without hesitation, and with the particular persuasiveness of someone who simply tells the truth and trusts that to be sufficient. The survey dispute was resolved in favor of the estate. The East Quarter stayed. In the parking lot afterward, Sam stood beside the truck with his jacket collar turned up against the April wind, and he looked out at the flat gray sky and let out a long, slow breath, and Penny, standing next to him, understood that she was watching someone put down a weight they'd been carrying since before she arrived. He would have wanted it, Sam said. About his uncle. Not to her specifically, more to the parking lot, to the resolution of a thing that had been left unfinished, but she was the one who was there. "I know," she said. He looked at her then, and it was a different kind of looking than usual. Not the assessing, practical attention he gave to problems. Something quieter. "I don't know what happens next," he said. "For you. Neither do I. The cattle need someone who knows them now. The heifer with the notched ear won't eat from the trough without you." A pause. The wind moved between them and settled. That's not a small thing on a working farm. She looked at him. He meant the cattle. He also meant more than the cattle, and they both knew it, and neither of them made the mistake of pretending otherwise. "I'm not in a hurry to go anywhere," she said, the almost smile again. She'd catalogued all its variations by now without meaning to. This one was the kind that reached his eyes. "Good," he said. "That's practical. Deeply practical. The most practical." She laughed. She hadn't laughed in. She genuinely couldn't remember how long. It surprised her enough that she put her hand over her mouth, and he watched her do it with an expression that was open in a way his face usually wasn't, and the parking lot was cold and gray, and the truck needed an oil change, and none of that mattered at all. She did not leave on Thursday's bus. She did not leave the following Thursday either, or the one after that. What she did instead was call her mother from the cabin one evening and describe, in the halting way of someone still assembling the shape of a thing as they speak it, what the last 6 weeks had looked like. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough to be notable, and then said, "You sound different. Different how? Like you're somewhere you're supposed to be." Penny looked out the cabin window at the last of the evening light moving across the pasture. The notch-eared heifer was at the fence line, waiting. Sam was coming up from the equipment shed, his jacket dark against the pale spring grass, and he raised a hand in her direction without looking up. Not a wave exactly. More an acknowledgement. The kind of gesture you make to someone who exists in your periphery so naturally that you know where they are without checking. "Yeah," Penny said. "I think I might be." 6 months later, in the smallest of ceremonies at the Moose Jaw Town Hall, with Shirley from the train station as one witness, and Sam's cousin from Swift Current as the other, Penny Ashcroft became Penny Fenn. She didn't take the name because anyone asked her to. She took it because it was the name on the deed to the land she'd been learning, season by season, to call home. Because the cattle knew her, and the East Quarter was settled, and the cabin cedar smell had worked its way into all of her winter clothes. Because Sam had asked her, plain and direct, and without any particular ceremony, one morning over coffee, if she'd be willing, and she'd thought about it for 30 seconds, and said yes, which was 30 seconds longer than she actually needed. The ceremony was 11 minutes long. Sam held her hand the entire time with the same steadiness he held everything, present, unhurried, committed to the reality of where he was. When it was finished, he looked at her in the way she'd learned to read by then, clear and quiet, and entirely certain. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Outside, the Saskatchewan sky was the particular pale blue of a late October afternoon, enormous and clean, and the 300 acres spread out under it the way they always did, patient and enduring, and asking nothing more than to be tended well. She had come to Moose Jaw expecting very little. She had come looking for a way out of something, not a way into anything. She had not expected to find a place that asked her to simply be capable and present and honest, and rewarded exactly that with the same in return. She had not expected Sam Fenn, but then, she'd learned by now, the things that hold you longest are rarely the ones you traveled toward on purpose. Sometimes they're the ones you were stranded into, on the coldest Tuesday in April, by a train and a dead man's practical letter, and a woman named Shirley who handed you a cup of tea and told you, without softening it, exactly what was true.